Moderator for today, along with Lori Moore, our co-chair of ORS. Today, we're excited to bring you this reference and readers advisory workshop. This is our last program for the year, but we're working on some very exciting things for next year. So we hope you'll stay tuned and keep a lookout for those things. I'll start with a little bit of information about Spencer's background. Then we'll have him start. If you have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat, and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. You may also raise your hand at the end of the workshop, and we'll be happy to call on you, and you can ask your question there. We will be recording this program, as you heard, just as that was announced. So here's a little more about Spencer Ellis. Spencer Ellis is an adult services librarian working at Jackson County Library Services in Medford, Oregon. After completing his MLIS from Wayne State University in 2019, Spencer spent the last 3 years providing reference, readers advisory, and programming for adults in public libraries. Spencer has served on library and community-wide committees devoted to equity, diversity, and inclusion, and believes in using new and creative approaches to provide patrons with accessible, exciting materials and services. Take it away, Spencer. Oops, you're on mute.
There we go. All right. Thank you so much again for introducing me. My name is Spencer. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for coming to this presentation on traditional reference and readers advisory. Let's go ahead and get started. It looks like a couple people are still trickling in, but hopefully they'll catch up as we go. All right, so to get started with just a quick agenda, today we're going to start with some introductions, and then we are going to move on to defining and comparing some terms, mostly talking about what reference and readers advisory mean in the context of this presentation, as well as what's traditional and non-traditional reference and readers advisory services. Next, we're going to talk about where and who participates in readers advisory and reference, and how to get more staff involved. Then we will move on to discussing the benefits of non-traditional services and expanding to incorporate those ideas. We will discuss and determine how to measure success for these methods. And then finally, I'm going to share some examples that have been really successful at JCLS. So hopefully you can incorporate those ideas or use them as inspiration for your own. By the end of the presentation, my hope is that you'll have both a better understanding of some unique and new ways to engage patrons in reference and readers advisory, as well as gain confidence in implementing those ideas at your library. So to introduce myself really quick, my name is Spencer, as we talked about. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm currently an adult services librarian or a reference librarian at Jackson County Library Services. We serve the Rogue Valley community in Jackson County in Southern Oregon, and I've been here for about 2.5 years, primarily with the city of Medford, which serves just under 100,000 people. Prior to that, I lived in Idaho and I worked at the Boise Public Library and the Nampa Public Library system, also with adults primarily. And I also graduated from Wayne State University with my MLIS in 2019 with a focus on library users and communities, which is basically just a fancy way of saying public services. So while I was in school, I took a ton of classes on readers advisory and reference. Those were my favorite topics. And what I realized during school is those were things that I was already kind of doing in my life. I loved as a kid recommending books to my parents and my friends and family. I loved going to the library and asking for those recommendations. And then I also loved research as a general. My favorite thing was to just kind of like get to the bottom of a really tricky or interesting question. So that's what brought me into librarianship, and that's what brought me here today as well. All right, so we are going to jump in with some definitions so we can be all on the same page about what we're talking about today. This first definition is for Reader's Advisory and comes from Joyce Saric's the book, A Reader's Advisory Service in the Public Library. This book was published in 1998, but it's still very relevant to what we're talking about today. So Saric's defines Reader's Advisory as a patron-centered library service for leisure readers. A successful reader's advisory service is one in which knowledgeable, non-judgmental staff help fiction and nonfiction readers with their leisure reading needs. In its purest form, staff help readers with all library collections that support leisure time pursuits. You'll notice that the word adult is crossed out here. This book is primarily focused on serving adults, but Saric's goes into detail about how Reader's Advisory Service is not just a service for adults. It's absolutely a service for all people that go to the library. I also want to draw emphasis on that last sentence about library collections, because as library collections have expanded, it is definitely not just a service that's for readers anymore. Readers advisory can also be video advisory, so to speak, for DVD and those types of materials, as well as other services and offerings that your library has. This second definition for reference comes from RUSA, the Reference and User Services Association. It came out in 2021 as their official definition, and they define reference as providing assistance by using expertise in response to an information need. The interaction is initiated by an individual or group of people working together. This includes a library worker recognizing an apparent information need and seeking to assist with it. Reference work aims to ensure that library users can find the resources they need when they want them. So talking about how these things are similar, at a basic level, both of these are devoted to finding materials for a patron. At a basic level, it's a patron has a need and we are trying to meet it. That could be leisure reading and that could be information needs, but either way, the goal is to narrow down what they're looking for and provide those resources. That can also mean library books, but it can mean other formats, it can mean other library resources, and it can mean non-library resources like government websites, e-comics, that sort of thing. And then lastly, they're both very similar in that they're very heavily focused on one-on-one or small group interactions, where a patron or a group of patrons normally initiates the request for assistance from a library staff member, and the library staff member goes through a sort of interview process of asking open-ended questions with the goal of narrowing down what the patron is looking for and then finding resources to fit that need. So somewhat different, but very similar concepts of readers advisory and reference services. So I kind of want to start the program with a quick brainstorming exercise. I'm going to encourage people to share in the chat, and the answer to this question: what activities, services, or ideas do you think of when you think about providing reference or readers advisory services to patrons? So I'm going to give people a couple moments to answer this question in the chat if they could. And then we'll talk about some of the answers. Give people another minute or two. I see lots of answers coming in. All right, I think it's slowed down a little bit, so we'll go ahead and go over some of them. So I see things like one-on-one interactions, providing tech or homework help, resources for assignments, actively listening to questions. I think that's a really important one. Referring people to resources, absolutely. Those things are definitely all kind of traditional reference readers advisory ideas. So some of the things that I have here are reference and readers advisory interviews, that kind of one-on-one help, asking open-ended questions to narrow down the patron's needs, that sort of thing. One-on-one assistance, sometimes group assistance as well. And then also things like passive displays, book lists, and LibGuides, which are really about libraries creating resources for patrons then use themselves, like book lists and LibGuides. So that one's a little more library initiated, but they're very much focused on providing services to single or groups of people. Traditional reference, though, is really hard to define because what makes something traditional is always changing. It's a very evolving concept. What people thought of as traditional 20 years ago, what people thought of as cutting edge, outside the box services 20 years ago is really what we'd call traditional now. Think of like email or chat-based reference services, for example. Very new 20 or 30 years ago, very traditional now, kind of a core part of what we do. So realistically, the things we talk about today, when we talk about non-traditional services, might be the same way. In a couple years, those could be things we don't do at all, or they could be things that are just such core integral parts of our services that we consider them to be a traditional main offering. So with that in mind, instead of kind of strictly defining what makes something traditional, I want to more loosely define reference and readers advisory traditional services as like those core concepts that we're trained on in library and information studies coursework, that we engage in at the desk or in our regular duties, that include those kinds of things, most of the things that people were suggesting. which brings us to the question, what makes non-traditional services different? What exactly is a non-traditional service? For starters, it's adaptable for less face-to-face interactions. It's no secret that over the last couple of years, libraries have largely been closed off and on, depending on your library. Some for only a couple months, some for much longer. But all of us have had to learn to adapt to having significantly less face-to-face interactions. Digital interactions are not necessarily a new concept. Email, phone, chat services, those have all been around a really long time, but we're having a much heavier reliance on providing core services through those interactions and much less interactions that are in person. I don't know about other people's libraries, but our library in Jackson County has been open about a year now, and we have steadily gained our patronage back, but it is less busy than it was before COVID. And we do still have a significantly higher rate of people that access us through our digital offerings as well. That's also true, not just for libraries, but as a whole, our world has become a lot more digital. So adapting to those to less face-to-face interactions allows us to have a much wider reach, whether it's advertising or reaching people that no longer go to the library or reaching people that never went to the library in the first place. So we can reach people at a much wider audience through things like our library website, the homepage of our Overdrive accounts, through printed materials, through social media, and a lot more. There's also less reliance on patron-initiated requests. Kind of in that same vein, if patrons aren't coming into the library as much, they're not requesting things as much. Even if it goes up in email and phone, it's for the most part, the total number of interactions that patrons are initiating has went down. So we needed to find ways to reach out to patrons to try and anticipate their needs or find ways to anticipate where they'll be and we can respond to their needs when they're there. So meeting people where they are, and then also reaching out to a much wider audience. Being able to try and anticipate people's needs has made us more able to interact with people that are reluctant to interact with traditional library staff, people that might have accessibility or language barriers to interacting with staff in the library, or people who just aren't aware of library services and so they haven't utilized them in the past. The next thing that makes non-traditional services different is the opportunity to upsell unique materials and formats. Non-traditional services doesn't just have to mean the way we present materials, but it can also be the materials themselves. Reader's advisory is very traditionally for readers, it's for books, but we can also expand that to include things like electronics and DVDs and library of things items. So things like cookware or bike equipment or camping equipment, things like that that are really unique services to your library, things that your library offers that are a great value to the community beyond just reader services. Right. The next one, opportunity to involve more staff. Because there are so many different ways through social media, through outreach, through in-person, non-traditional services, there are tons of different ways to approach new and exciting things in reference and reader's advisory that you can also see it as an opportunity to involve more staff of all levels and interests, including staff with different levels of experience and training as well. And then lastly, it's new and exciting. By definition, non-traditional means it's something we haven't done before. So it's an opportunity to try something new, be creative and artistic, and create something that's really unique to your community. So expanding on that last slide, the bullet before last about staff involvement in readers advisory and reference services, it can really be an opportunity to get buy-in from staff of all levels and experiences and educational backgrounds related to these services. Traditional reference interviews and readers advisory are often considered services provided by librarians specifically, or others that have completed an MIS or other training to perform those tasks. But it doesn't only have to be those people that are doing this service. You can involve more than just librarians, definitely. A survey on readers advisory conducted by the Library Journal in 2021 found that 44% of surveyed librarians said that they struggle to provide readers advisory to patrons in genres they're not comfortable with or not familiar with. This is a great opportunity to get more people involved because the more staff you have involved, the more of a wide base knowledge you will have to provide to your patrons. The more staff involved, the more interesting genres, the more knowledge about reference resources, that kind of thing. So it really provides a more well-rounded knowledge base to have all staff involved in readers advisory and reference, and also provides better service for patrons so that they can come up to any desk and receive high quality service. It's also an opportunity to train staff. So kind of along that same line, because these tasks are a little less focused on one-on-one patron-initiated interactions, they're an opportunity for librarians and other senior staff to partner with interested staff that maybe don't have that experience or knowledge related to readers advisory, and build up those skills for those employees. Additionally, statistically speaking, because staff of marginalized identities are already really rare in libraries, and they're even less likely when they do work in libraries to have an MLIS or be in a management role. Staff at entry levels that are statistically way more likely to be marginalized identities can then have opportunities to have professional development and an eye for equity within your library organization, through non-traditional means of learning, not necessarily through that educational background, but through experience doing those tasks. Can also play to the strengths and interests of your employees. The more people involved, the more likely you're going to have a wide variety of interests for people that want to make reference and readers advisory services available. Staff that like crafts or genealogy or car help or whatever it may be, there's a good chance that your patrons are interested in those things too in your community. So finding staff that are knowledgeable and able to talk about those things and provide those services is a great way to provide that service to your community. And then lastly, involve outreach staff in spaces outside of traditional library buildings. Someone in the chat mentioned library pop-ups, and this is a great example of something that you can do to try and reach more people and involve more staff. You don't want to be afraid to include staff that are not traditionally in the library. Maybe that's outreach people that go to other businesses. Maybe that's involving volunteers to an extent. Maybe that's utilizing more online spaces or your bookmobile or partnering with businesses to leave printed materials there. So there's a lot of different ways that you can go outside the library's traditional spaces to reach patrons. So how do we measure success? As we talked about before, traditional generally means things like one-on-one, patron-initiated requests, displays, that sort of thing. For a lot of traditional reference and research advisory, the biggest measurement of success is simply, did we find the answer for the patron? For ready reference, that might mean literally, did we find an answer? And for more in-depth help for research or homework, or even for readers advisory as well, it might mean, did we find them valuable resources? Did we find them recommendations that they are excited about? Things that then they can take home and utilize and decide if it fits their needs. Other ways of measuring success are things like patron return rate. If a patron is coming to the library for a recommendation and then leaves that recommendation and comes back a few days later for another, that can be a good indicator that you did something right, that they liked your recommendation. Similar with research help. If you're helping someone and they come back for additional help, that's probably a good indication that they trust you to be able to assist them with their information needs. That kind of works in reverse as well. If a patron doesn't come back to you, comes back to a different staff member, a different library, that sort of thing, it can be an indicator that what you were trying to do didn't work, unfortunately. So patron return rate can be a really useful measurement of success. Circulation patterns and display turnover also, for displays especially, if items are just flying off the shelf, that can be a great indicator that that was something that was valuable to your community, had a high interest level, that sort of thing, and vice versa.
Hi, Brandy. My name is Serene Rock. I was trying to.
Oh, there we go. Where was I? So, oh yeah, displays. So if an item is just flying off the shelf, there's a good chance that there's a high interest level for your patrons in your community, and vice versa. If you are seeing things stay, then that's a good indicator that there's not that much interest. There's also the opportunity to look at circulation patterns. Some software has the ability to run reports and see how items are circulating after they've been added to a display or a book list and that kind of thing. So that can also see not just what's being taken off the display, but also what's being checked out and taken home. And then lastly, another really important measurement of success is patron feedback. This is maybe one of the most helpful, but it's also maybe one of the least common, unfortunately. Patrons that are regulars might give us great feedback especially if they're coming in for new recommendations regularly, that sort of thing. But a lot of patrons just need one-off help. They need to find books on, rebuilding their deck, and then they've finished the project, so they're not coming back in for additional help. At the library where I work in Medford, we are right next to a Greyhound station, so we get a lot of patrons that need help, that are on their way elsewhere, that are traveling just through the area. So patron feedback is really valuable, but it can also be hard to come by, unfortunately. So this brings us to the question, do new types of services mean new measurements of success? Thankfully, not really for the most part. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. We can really just adapt traditional methods to the non-traditional services that we're providing. So again, turnover and checkout statistics can be incredibly valuable. Physical books and other materials like library of things items or other non-traditional offerings that you're putting on a display, same thing. You can see how fast they're going off the shelf. If you have the ability to run reports, see what the checkout rate is like for those items after they're being advertised, that sort of thing. You can also look at other quantitative data. So for example, if you're doing a non-traditional reference or reader's advisory service through a pop-up online event through Facebook Live or something like that, you can look up the statistics of how many people interacted and that sort of thing. Again, patron feedback is still great. With non-traditional services, it can be a little harder because you don't have that built-in relationship of ongoing service. That's a very traditional long-standing offering. But especially for regulars, you can ask for feedback. You can solicit feedback, say, what did you think of this new idea, that kind of thing. So patrons can still be really valuable in that regard. And then again, return rate. If you are trying a new project or a new series or program or that kind of thing, and a patron keeps coming back, again, it can be a really great indicator of success. That being said, there's definitely opportunities to consider alternative measurements of success. These are, unique offerings you haven't tried before, so it might be the case that you need a unique measurement of success. That's definitely where qualitative measurements can come in. For example, how were patrons engaging with the materials you provided? How did patrons interact with other patrons or other staff members as a result of the service or project you're trying to provide? This is definitely an example of something where trial and error is important as well, because it's something that's a new project. It can be really hard to determine what information you need to determine if it was successful. So trial and error, specifically in measuring success, can be really helpful. All right, so we've talked about what constitutes non-traditional readers advisory and reference services, why they can be great tools, and getting all different types of staff and different types and levels of staff involved. Now I want to share some examples of services and projects I and my colleagues at JCLS have found to be very successful for our patrons. I want to start with a few examples of relatively long-standing kind of traditional concepts that are used in creative or new ways. The first being book lists. Book lists at JCLS, we put them on our website, we put them in printed versions and leave them available in the library as well as outside the library for people to pick up around town in our community. And otherwise, unconventional ways of doing book lists can be really a great way to present new, eye-catching, fun, engaging information to patrons in ways they might not have thought of before. So at JCLS, we always try and highlight staff members' lists on our website, for example, on our homepage, and we go out of our way to try and make sure that it's a wide variety of staff that have created book lists, so that we can highlight the work and creativity of staffs at all levels, at all branches, that sort of thing. This first example here is an example of a patron requested list that ended up being very popular with the public as well. That was focused on a fun research topic. This patron wanted to know about how the brain processes mistakes. So this book list kind of dives into like neurological processes in regards to why human beings make mistakes and fail and that sort of thing. So just kind of a fun patron request. The second example is a niche dive into common requests that we get. That's one thing you can do is look at what patrons regularly request and try and find them a new perspective or a new way of looking at those requests. So cookbooks are a very popular item at Jackson County Library, but we try and highlight fun cookbooks or cookbooks that patrons might not have thought of. We had a display at one point that was very similar to this, and we got feedback of patrons saying like, I cook with cheese all the time, but I never would have thought there would be cookbooks specifically for that. So trying to kind of highlight fun niche categories within larger patron popular requests. And then also lists that highlight marginalized voices and celebrations. We always try and make sure that there is accurate and a wide variety of representation within all of our displays, book lists, materials, but there's also a lot of inherent value in highlighting specifically marginalized voices and communities in a more intentional way. So going out of our way to make those resources available and center those voices that are normally not heard. Another great example of a book list here that I don't have a picture of, unfortunately, it was just published this week, is a response to public like social media trending topics. So we just published a book list on quiet quitting as a result of that being a very popular concept that's going around on social media and in the news in recent weeks. And then lastly, something I want to mention about book lists is that you can always consider unconventional materials on your book lists as well. JCLS used to have catalog software called BiblioCommons. Unfortunately, we no longer have it, but that provided us with the ability to add things to our book lists that were not actually materials in the catalog. We could link to outside resources, to websites, to library of things, items, that sort of stuff. So you can really utilize book lists for much more than just books. You can utilize it for reference and research and links to community resources, that kind of thing. Another moderately recent take on Reader's Advisory and to a lesser degree reference help is using a format of like a Google form or a Microsoft form to encourage patrons to fill out their reading history, likes, dislikes, that sort of thing, and get some recommendations in return. I've seen this over the last 5 or more years, increasing in popularity, but really, especially in the last couple of years during COVID. JCLS launched this during COVID and it was immensely popular and thankfully has continued to be popular even as the libraries have reopened. So at JCLS, the way we do this is that we have patrons fill out a form and then we have a 3-day turnaround period where we can give them 15 recommendations, all of items that are currently available at their preferred branch that meet their needs. We've also expanded to using this as reference and sometimes utilize these as like a form of people asking for resources for homework help or tax guides, that kind of thing. And then we can have a nice, easy list of all of those items that the patron requested available to them. We can also market these kinds of services in non-traditional ways. For example, with JCLS Discovery, we put it on social media, on our website, and through our patron newsletter by email. But we also used bookmarks in all items that were picked up during front door service with a QR code and instructions on how to fill out this form. And we got really great feedback from that. It's been very successful during front door service when we had those bookmarks. We were regularly getting multiple list requests a day. And we even have some regulars that really show that successful return rate. We have one patron that fills one out about every other month and has for the last 2 years. So keeping those long-standing patrons has been a great show of success for this project. Related to advertising and social media, this is a tool in itself that can be used in non-traditional ways. Libraries are definitely not new to social media presence and have been answering reference and circulation questions through social media for years. But they're really finding new ways to reach patrons. So the first example I have here on the left, I actually stole from another library. I stole from Multnomah County. Kudos to anyone in the audience from this library today. It's the only thing in my project that Jackson County Library Services hasn't done. And in this example, you can see a Reader's Advisory patron engagement opportunity called Book for Tat, where they used a hashtag to track it and had patrons tag their pictures of their tattoos, and then library staff respond with reading suggestions. I've also seen very similar things be successful at JCLS and other libraries through social media, things that like recommendations based on pop culture references, like your favorite D&D character, favorite video game, or other just like pop culture references to use as Reader's Advisory beyond just what people were reading previously. This second example in the middle is something JCLS has done for a few years now, posting Friday Reads photos of popular available titles for checkout to patrons and encouraging them to share what they're currently reading. This drives patron engagement because it's more than just about likes and retweets and that kind of thing. It really encourages patrons to get involved in their own reading and readers advisory habits. A really successful example of a Friday Reads might have 20 or more comments of patrons responding to each other saying, oh, I read that book too. What do you think about reading this book next? So really getting involved on their own with readers advisory has been a great example of success for this project. Seeing how patrons aren't just taking our reference advice or reference and readers advisory advice, but getting involved on their own as well. And then this last one on the right is Book Talk. Probably most people have heard of it at one time or another, which is a kind of subgroup on TikTok that's devoted to reading recommendations, book reviews, and that sort of thing. This really was popularized by individual TikTokers, but some libraries have made videos with great success and great popularity, highlighting their resources in a non-traditional way as well. And then still along the lines of using tools like book lists and social media that aren't really new in and of themselves, we can also use passive spaces or display materials for readers advisory and reference help as well. So this first photo, unfortunately, I don't have a photo of the entire project because it was quite large and took up a lot of space. But this is a snippet of a book flowchart that was available in nonfiction for about 6 months last year. Patrons can follow a series of yes or no questions that lead to additional questions and ultimately lead to reading suggestions based on their answers. So they'll get 3 title suggestions based on their answers, and there was a total of 21 titles suggested through this flowchart. And then we would regularly update both the questions and the reading recommendations themselves so that patrons were encouraged to come back and still be engaged the next time they go through the chart. Another great example of using passive space is this Bookflix display in our teen department. It was designed to highlight new and interesting materials in a recognizable format. The teen department has changed the titles on this display frequently, though, and has also changed the categories based on the most recent teen book club title, new releases based on patron requests, and more. So really being responsive to patrons and highlighting community interests. And then another one that I don't have a picture of yet because it hasn't happened. This coming spring, we're going to be tying in a take and make program for patrons with the Reader's Advisory Service. So we're going to be giving out supplies and a book spine template for patrons to take home and decorate a book spine however they'd like, and include the title of a book that is either a favorite or a particularly meaningful nonfiction title, and then bring that template back to the library, and we will be able to put it up on the wall and create basically a patron-created bookshelf of recommended titles that are available in the library. So again, just really looking for unique ways to get patrons involved in the reference and readers advisory process themselves. All right, I mentioned previously that one way that readers advisory and reference can be done through non-traditional means is also through non-traditional methods of delivery and being outside of libraries' physical or online spaces. That can mean partnering with local businesses or just going where people are and are likely to need those resources and kind of meeting them where they are. Bookmobiles themselves aren't really a new concept, but we're trying to find new ways to use them, which is what the goal of the JCLS DART van is. This DART van stands for the Direct Access to Resources and Technology, and it travels around the county providing Wi-Fi access and checkout ability for laptops, tablets, and other electronics. But it also provides access to library staff that help with research, homework, resource finding, and other reference help, as well as access to readers advisory from the staff that staff the van, and by providing access to technology where they can sign up for discovery lists and that sort of thing. This is really great because it meets people where they are. It's less focused on those one-on-one patron initiated interactions and more focused on going out into the community and visits things like churches, parks, community centers, largely focused on our most rural areas in our county that have the lowest rate of internet access and higher rates of poverty and marginalization. So trying to find patrons that need us the most and are least likely to come into the library and meeting them where they are. All right, and the last set of examples I want to share is a project I'm particularly proud of being part of, the Jackson County Library blog. We work with our marketing team. This started in late spring, early summer of 2020. I want to say it was in May, very early in COVID while the library was still closed. And it was planned as a way to connect with patrons beyond just offering front door service. It was planned as a way to kind of imitate those one-on-one conversations between patrons and staff in ways that we couldn't do since the building was closed. So we have a team of writers. At one point, it was as little as 4 people. At other times, it's been as many as 7, with all of us having a slightly different focus or topic, whether that's writing about different genres or writing about different age groups and different themes. And we've published these blogs about twice a week, every week since 2020 in May. We recently transitioned to once a week just for staffing capabilities, and that has been still very successful. Many of our posts kind of started as a sort of book talk where we'd share favorite books, interesting genres to explore, new ideas, or fun or educational resources. So that's what this first example is here. It's an example of kind of a book talk focused post that highlights the importance of laughter. So it talks about why laughter is important on a neurological level, why it's important for the brain and for human health. But then it's also paired with the writer's experience about books that have made them laugh, as well as a book list for a variety of genres and ages that are designed to encourage laughter. We've also been able to examine other interests based on writers. So for the example, this one comes from an author that's a children's librarian and mostly focused on crafts and hands-on activities. So this one connects library readers advisory to programming and other services. And the blog post was designed as a DIY craft how-to guide. And then at the end, it links to a recorded story time that was recorded during COVID, as well as a book list that are all focused on the same theme. So I believe this one was a carnival theme, and the recorded story time that it linked to was based on carnival books, and the book list was as well. So really trying to tie in patrons' interests from readers advisory to programming to in-person, like fun, hands-on activities. Some others that we haven't pictured here that we've done based on readers advisory are things that have a wide variety of themes. The theme that I normally write most frequently is with an ED&I focused lens, examining things like an introduction to the concept of mirrors and windows for readers, and also talking about more personal discussions of representation of disability, LGBTQ+ identity, body positivity, and more in a variety of genres and formats. This has really gained popularity over time, and this popularity has continued as the library has transitioned out of COVID and back to in-person services. One of the great measures of success for this has been how large our audience has grown. The first month we started with a total of 440 viewers, I believe, and now we average somewhere between about 1,200 and 2,000, depending on the month and depending on the interest level for the individual blogs. So it's really, that's between 3 and 6 times as popular as it was originally, which has been a great marker of continued success, that it continues to grow even as the library has reopened as well. It's also been a great opportunity to include guest writers who are mostly non-librarian staff, again, just trying to incorporate experience and kind of on-the-job training for staff that might not have more traditional educational opportunities. As it has grown, we've also been able to move just beyond just readers advisory and also go into reference as a response to patron requests, trending news stories, upcoming library events and programs, that sort of thing. We've been able to highlight databases and research help. We've had blog posts about tax help, that sort of thing, as well as like local interest topics. So this example is one that's highlighting local resources through the library and through our community. So for example, the Rogue Valley is a huge hiking community. We're very close to the Pacific Crest Trail, and we have a very heavy hiking population, spring through fall, but really even all year round. So this post is an example of using both non-local and local resources to highlight hiking opportunities through the All Trails app, as well as other similar apps and local books and guides and that kind of thing. In a completely different direction, this next example examined the details of the case and potential impacts of Dobbs versus the Jackson Women's Health Organization, which overturned Roe v. Wade. So the post discussed what the case decided, what protections the state of Oregon currently has in place, and how Oregon might be impacted by future legislation or an influx of out-of-state patients seeking abortion services. And we tried to basically break down a really big topic that was very important to a lot of people in a more approachable way with links to more information, news stories, resources within the library, that sort of thing. Some other examples of reference blogs that we have done that are not pictured here are ones that have went over laws and other political events, shared how to critically evaluate news sources, discussed how censorship impacts libraries and book publishing, and dove into the history of specific ED&I related celebrations and holidays like Juneteenth and Disability Pride Month. This really started as a way to communicate during COVID, but has been a great way to continue to build connections with our community and provide fun and educational materials for patrons. It's also gotten really excellent feedback from all ages. It's not uncommon for patrons to come into the children's library with their families and say, when is the next craft blog post coming up? I'm really excited for it. So we get a lot of positive feedback from children and families, but we also get positive feedback and engagement through social media posts and in person in our adult departments as well. We've even at times gotten requests from patrons about topics they'd like us to cover. So that's been great as well. So as you can tell, there's a ton of different ways, from online services to in-person outreach events to printed materials, that you can approach in a new and unique way to providing reference and readers advisory. So in terms of applying those things to your library, some things to keep in mind are being creative. Maybe that's implementing an example you saw here. Maybe that's using examples here as inspiration to do something totally new. That's wonderful. And maybe that's leaning on your staff and your community's unique interests and resources and knowledge to do something that's creative and unique to your community. And then next, get buy-in wherever you can. That might be buy-in from your supervisor for time to work on these projects. That might be buy-in from people in another department that handle your marketing and social media. So just getting buy-in from staff to get the word out to patrons. And that might be buy-in from regular patrons that you have a strong relationship with. Maybe that's soliciting honest feedback from those strong relationship patrons. Maybe that's asking them to tell their friends and get the word out that way. So getting buy-in wherever you can is really important. Starting small. So it is always easier to start small, assess, determine the time, staffing, budget needs of an idea that you have, and then expand than it is to do vice versa. If you start too big and then struggle with it, you might lose buy-in from supervisors. You might lose buy-in from the community because something didn't go as expected, and it might just be harder to get started next time. So start small and then expand, not vice versa. Keep it accessible and inclusive. So traditional library services, unfortunately, have a lot of accessibility issues, whether that's the building itself, modes of communication, lack of alternative languages available in the library, systemic racism that's built into our public policies and our hiring practices. Whatever it is, libraries, unfortunately, historically, and even currently have barriers to access. So this is an opportunity to do something new and to bridge that gap and try and reach those community members, as well as just cast a very wide umbrella for the people that we serve and the people that we value in our libraries. It's an opportunity to educate your community about ED&I topics and marginalized identities, provide windows into those lives. And it's also an opportunity to encourage representation of your most marginalized people and show that we see them and value them in our community. So provide that mirror effect. And it can be anything from having a variety of formats that you present something in, using colorblind friendly materials, highlighting inclusive titles, and valuing representation. It can be a lot of different ways, but the most important thing is to try and make sure that you can reach as many people as possible and remove as many barriers to access as possible through these ideas. And then lastly, accept failure as part of the process. I think most of us have been in a situation where we had a program or a display or an idea that we thought was so exciting that we thought patrons were going to love, and then it just flops. Unfortunately, that's kind of a part of life, and that's probably going to happen with all parts of library world, including non-traditional services. You might have an idea you're really excited about that just doesn't do well, and that's okay. Learn from it and then use that knowledge that you gain to provide better service going forward. It's also okay to accept that something that's successful at one point might turn into a failure at a future time. Maybe it's something that was really, really successful for while your library was closed due to COVID. But once the library has opened up, there's just not that need for that service anymore. So being able to reevaluate and accept that something doesn't always have to be successful can also be a really important thing to keep in mind and use to not feel like you're failing, but just learning from your attempts. All right, and that is everything I have for you today. Thank you everyone for attending. Thank you to Meredith and Lori for facilitating and helping today, and for OLA and the State Library of Oregon and all of the other sponsors for having me as a presenter with you. I think that's everything, and I think we are ready for questions. I'm going to go ahead and stop screen sharing so I can see people if they decide to turn on their cameras.
All right. Well, thank you, Spencer, so much. And you can write questions in the chat, or you can raise your hand using the reaction. I'm sure, much like myself, you all have a list of great ideas. And I even have now a blog post to go to for reading recommendations for my son. So I'm excited to stop doing this afterwards and run and see that blog so I can get these recommendations. So let us know if you have questions, and we'll be happy to have Spencer answer those for us. So we have a question in the chat. Do you offer cultural passes at your library?
Unfortunately, we do not yet. It's something we're working on, though. It is our Library of Things committee regularly evaluates and adds new things to the collection, mainly based on recommendations from our community members and our staff as well. And that's something that's been on our recommendation list. It's something we're in the process of trying to coordinate what that looks like for various local offerings, so local museums and that kind of thing. It's something we're trying to do, but unfortunately have not quite got there yet.
All right, Courtney, I see your hand up. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thank you. So I really enjoy doing readers advisory, but I found sometimes people just don't know they can just ask us for a good book. I think they're very used to a traditional, like, I have a specific question and a specific answer. So have you had tips, or have had other people had success just getting the word out, like, we can just chat about books?
I think it kind of depends. We have 15 branches in our system, and they're very wide of variety. We have one that is one room, has 2 staff members, and then we have one that is 2 floors, probably close to 100 staff members. So it kind of varies depending on where you are. I think encouraging signage is a really important part, like having signage at your service desks that say, be willing to interrupt us, ask me about a good book, those kinds of things. So having something in the library that reminds people they're allowed to do that. And then also just bringing it up and meeting people where they are. So in the Dart Van, mentioning to patrons like, hey, have you read anything good lately? Do you want any recommendations? That sort of thing. Being willing to initiate those conversations, because like you said, people don't always know that those things are things they can ask for.
Yeah, thank you.
We have another question from chat. And how far out in advance do you plan your blog post topics?
That's a good question. It kind of varies depending on the writer. We generally currently we have 5 writers, and we meet once every 5 weeks. So we have a due date shortly before we meet. We critique each other's work, and then in that meeting, and then make changes and post every 5 weeks. And then sometime during that 5-week period, you write your next draft and and start the process again. I imagine for some staff members, they have it planned out months in advance. I actually know that our children's librarian, if you look at her calendar, she has, months and months worth of planning of library blogs that she's going to write. Some of us are a little bit more loose with it and will respond to, trending topics, what's going on right now in the world, that kind of thing. So it varies. We generally plan at least a few weeks in advance, but more than that depends on the staff person.
Great. And I think we have at least one more question, and it is, has your library been affected by the uptick in censorship efforts? And if so, has that been reflected at all in your programming or services?
I would say yes to being affected, although we've been very thankful to not be impacted in the ways that some specific libraries have. There's a school district in our county, in Jackson County, that has had multiple books challenged by parents, have had people showing up to board meetings, that sort of thing. And thankfully, we haven't had too many requests for reconsideration. We do have very animated board meetings sometimes, but as far as the actual materials themselves, we haven't had too many challenges, thankfully. I will say also, I'm very grateful to work in a system that I feel like we have a lot of support for our frontline staff from our admin team. So our admin, is willing to hear, always willing to hear the feedback from the public in regards to like things that they feel should be challenged or censored or that sort of thing. But they're also very firmly in the camp of supporting staff in the things that they know how to do. So supporting staff in their collection development goals and projects, and supporting staff in their programming. We have, if anything, seen an uptick in our programming related to marginalized people and offerings, author talks from authors that write about marginalization, that sort of thing. And our blog posts too. Even just right now, I'm currently writing a series on Supreme Court cases, and I have had to do some extra tweaking to make sure that admin was aware of what I was writing about, but they've been very supportive of me writing that. I don't feel like there's been once where we've been told we needed to tone it down, kind of thing. So that's good.
All right. Well, I don't see any more questions in the chat, but we thank you once again, Spencer, for your fantastic talk. And this will be posted on the OLA website so that you can watch it again and show all of your friends, and so that we can all have these fantastic ideas. So thank you once again, and we look forward to seeing you in the spring.